Dawn should be breaking over Minas Tirith, but the east is a wall of ash. Frost crawls across stone. Horses rear, cocks choke silent, and above Mordor the last white edge of the moon gutters out. In the Shire, lamps burn at breakfast. In Rohan, mothers clutch children and listen to wolves. Somewhere beyond sight, two holy hands let go, and the sky opens like a wound. If this shadowed history grips you, leave a like, subscribe for more journeys into Middle-earth, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Every voice gathered here keeps these old fires lit. 3 nights earlier, the change had begun so quietly that most of Middle-earth took it for weather. The moon rose late over the Eifel Duath, pale and wandering, not on its proper road, but drifting as if distracted by some far-off glimmer. Fishermen at Dol Amroth cursed the tide when it dragged their boats half onto the mud, and then, an hour later, rushed back in a snarling wall that smashed keels against the pilings. In the Shire, old Holman Greenhand stepped it to his cabbage patch and stared up until his pipe went out between his teeth. The moonlight was wrong. It did not fall, it hovered. In Minas Tirith, Gandalf stood alone on the high wall and watched the same white disk shudder in the heavens. He had seen storms rolled out of the sea and red vapors from Orodruin, but this was no working of wind or mountain. The light itself seemed uncertain of its task. Behind him, the city breathed uneasily. Smithies still rang. Bakers still kneaded dough by lantern. Children still argued in the sixth circle, drowsy and loud, until their mothers snapped at them to hush. Yet the air had grown sharper. Even in the kitchens, steam turned quickly to wet silver mist, and the servants muttered that winter had entered the stones. Denethor came to the parapet in his sable robes, the gems on his collar hard as ice in the ghostly light. His face, cut by sleeplessness and pride, remained stern, but his eyes did not leave the sky. "You have a name for this," he said. Gandalf did not answer at once. Far below, the great gate boomed shut for the night, and the sound rolled across the Pelennor like a warning to empty fields. At times, Gandalf said at last, the old world gives signs before it breaks. Denethor's mouth tightened. A riddle is ash to hungry men. Is this Sauron's doing? No, said Gandalf. And for a moment that should have brought comfort, it brought only colder fear. That is why I do not like it. In Barad-dûr, where no lamp was needed and every chamber held its own dull red glow, Sauron had already heard the reports. The Nazgûl knelt in a ring below his throne. Black helms bowed, their voices like knives dragged across slate. They spoke of the moon veering north of its course, of orcs pausing in their marches to howl, of captains along the Morannon whispering that the sky was becoming ownerless. Sauron rose. Even among his servants, none dared look fully at him, but dread altered shape when he moved. His will pressed outward, vast, disciplined, merciless. Yet in that instant there was a single fracture in it, a pulse of surprise. He went to the narrow window cut in the tower and looked east where no mortal eye could have seen farther than night and smoke. He saw more than that. He saw absence where order should have been. Not by my hand, he said. The Witch King lifted his head. Yet it profits us. For a time, said Sauron. That answer silenced them all. In the Westfold, where the wind usually moved clean over grass like a hand over fur, it came that night with a rank scent from the mountains, as if old caves had opened. A shepherd boy named Círdan woke to the sheep pressing so tightly against the pens that 2 lambs suffocated before dawn that was not dawn. His mother went out wrapped in a coarse wool cloak and found frost on the troughs in high summer. She listened to the dark and heard not one wolf, but several, calling from different ridges, nearer than any had come in years. By the next night, no owl hunted openly in the Shire. The insects had gone still. Mills along the water ran slower, and folk came to their doors holding candles against the thickened dark as though peering through cloth. In Hobbiton, Milo Burrows lit a second breakfast fire because the first had burned low and yet the morning would not brighten. The smell of peat and bacon mingled with unease. His smallest daughter asked why the birds had forgotten to sing. No one answered her. What had happened beyond the circles of the world was hidden then from every living thing in Middle-earth, save one who had once dwelt in the West, and another who sat in a tower of hatred and searched everywhere for power. But the truth was already moving toward them. Tilion had long loved wandering. Even when the moon first sailed the heavens, he had not kept his road with perfect obedience. He was a hunter in spirit still, quickened by silver distances, often drawn toward the greater blaze of Arien, as a moth is drawn to flame, though it cannot survive the touch. Arien had always been different. She was not fickle, and fear had little dwelling in her. Before the sun was made, she had tended the golden bloom of Lorelei and gone unharmed among radiance that would have consumed others. Yet both felt it in those last hours. Not a hand upon the rein, not a command, a hunger. It rose from the marred substance of Arda itself, from old evil deepened by ages of war, sharpened by the growing power in Mordor, and by a malice older even than Sauron. Morgoth had poured much of himself into the world, and nothing wholly pure moved through it without brushing some trace of that ancient poison. For long ages the sun and moon had endured it. Now, as the ring returned toward the land where it had been forged, and all wills strained toward one cataclysm, the stain quickened. In the airs above the world, it gathered like invisible webbing. Tilion felt the first thread enter the cold fire of Isil and panicked. His light fluttered. The moon swerved. He looked toward the west for counsel, but the bent world after Numenor did not answer swiftly. The ways between mortal lands and Armen were no longer plain, and in that hesitation he felt a second thread, and a third, and he fled. Arien held longer. She drove the sun through one full course, with blackness gnawing at its heart, and in her wrath the flames of Anna burned white. But she saw what Tilion had seen, and more besides. If the unlight rooted deeper, the sun would not merely fail, it could be turned. Its fire could be made into a scourge to scorch the fields of Middle-earth, to burn rivers to mist, to blind every eye lifted in prayer. So Arien made the choice no one below would understand. She stepped from the vessel of the sun and let it drift beyond the rim of sight, rather than wield a corrupted day over a doomed world. 2 guardians left their courses in terror of becoming weapons, and below, every creature called it night. The second morning never came. Across Gondor, the beacon hills still stood, but their watchmen stared eastward until their torches hissed in the cold. Ramas Ekor lay under a dull sheen of frost. Men slapped numb hands against breastplates and muttered that this must be the final sign before conquest. In the markets of Minas Tirith, the smell of fresh bread gave way to lamp oil and stale fear. Women bought more salt than flour. Old men who had lived through plague and raid closed their shutters before the hour when sunlight should have struck them. Denethor did not leave the tower chamber for half a day. When he emerged, his face seemed carved from older stone. He summoned the captains, and his voice carried through the hall with cruel steadiness. "The enemy has cast his veil across the heavens. Let no man say Gondor crouched. Double the watches, ration oil, light every court. The city shall not darken while I rule." It was brave, and it was false. Gandalf heard the falsehood and said nothing then, because fear required scaffolding before truth could bear weight. But when the lords had gone, and only Pippin remained beside the pillar, small and pale and silent, Gandalf turned to Denethor. "This is no veil of Sauron," he said. Denethor looked at him with sudden naked anger. "Then the world has grown more lawless than I thought. It has grown more wounded. Do not speak to me of wounds, Mithrandir. I have spent my life binding them, while your wandering wisdom blew in and out like weather." Gandalf's eyes, deep with pity and weariness, did not flinch. And if the very hands that guide the heavens have withdrawn, what then will the steward bind with his pride? For one heartbeat, the question struck home. Denethor's gaze faltered toward the eastern windows, toward the black noon beyond them. Then pride sealed the crack again. "I will not have the city ruled by fear of legends." Yet he feared them already. That night he went once more to the Palantir, seeking certainty, and found instead a darkness Sauron gladly let him see. While Gondor armed itself, Rohan moved under a sky with no promise in it. The muster at Dunharrow became a gathering of breath and iron beneath frozen stars. Horses steamed in the dark. Men ate little because appetite shrank under dread. Theoden, old yet newly restored, walked among them with his hand on mane and shoulder alike, speaking low words that had once seemed too late and now seemed all that stood between his people and collapse. Many glanced past him to the east. No paling, no line of gold, only mountains as black as broken teeth. Éowyn stood near the king in mail that caught starlight like cold water. Merry, tucked beneath a borrowed helm, smelled horse sweat, leather, and the bitter resin of pine torches. He had known fear before, but not this sort. This was not battle approaching. This was the world forgetting itself. The riders wait for dawn, one young man said, teeth chattering though he was not cold alone. How are they to ride if it never comes? Theoden heard him. Then we ride by faith, the king said. There were stars before there was sun. The words travelled through the host. Some straightened, some did not. In the rear ranks, 3 men of Harrowdale slipped away before the march began, taking 2 laden ponies and a sack of dried meat. Before noon, that was dark, they were found on the lower paths with their throats torn out. Wolves had followed the deserters where duty might have hidden them. Far away, Frodo and Sam stumbled across the slag heaps of Mordor under a darkness that should have helped them, but did not. Mordor by starlight was not gentler. Without the sun, the fumes from the mountain clung low and thick, turning each breath sour. The ash underfoot held the chill of grave dust. Sam could not tell 1 hour from another. He tried to count their rest by sips of water and by Frodo's trembling, but both had become unreliable measures. Gollum's tracks vanished and reappeared like scratches made by a thought. Frodo looked once at the blank east and whispered, "What if there is no morning left?" Sam had no answer worthy of him. He put an arm around Frodo's shoulders and said only, "Then we will do for this one what has to be done. They went on. At the Grey Havens, Círdan watched the sea turn mean. With the moon gone from its duty, tides came unmoored from memory. The water withdrew so sharply at one duskless hour that wet rocks jutted bare half a mile out, glistening like bones. Then it returned with violence, dragging barrels, nets, and one screaming gull into the black surf. The shipwrights worked by lantern to secure the white vessels at anchor, and their hammers rang across the harbour with a desperate, mortal haste that no elf had carried in older days. Círdan alone among them suspected a thing beyond weather. He had seen the first sunrise of the world after the trees were lost. He had watched ages bend and kings fail. Looking up at the star-pricked dark, he spoke softly to no one visible. "Why have you left them?" No answer came from the heavens. The third turning might have ended all hope before swords ever crossed. On the roads of Anórien, the Rohirrim rode by hidden paths, and darkness gave them cover. It also gave cover to those who would sell them. A Gondorian guide named Targon, lean and soft-spoken, had been sent by secret way from Minas Tirith to lead the riders through the Stonewain Valley. He knew every deer track, every ford where hoofbeats could be muffled. For 2 days, he rode at the head of the column and said little. Men trusted him because there was no time not to. On the second black morning, he slipped away from the line under pretense of scouting ahead. He had already sent word to a band of Mordor orcs through a cousin in Lossarnach, a bargain struck when the sky failed and courage curdled into arithmetic. "Spare my house," he had promised them. "Spare my sons, and I will give you a king in the dark." He would not reach the orcs. An arrow took him through the throat from the trees before he had gone 100 yards. The shaft was feathered white. Legolas stepped from shadow and looked down with cool grief, as if betrayal bored him less than it saddened him. Aragorn came after, his face grey with fatigue from the paths of the dead and the long river road. The dead men followed behind, dim as moonlight on a grave. Gimli snorted at the corpse. So ends a bargain. Aragorn knelt and found in Targon's satchel a scrap of waxed parchment, marked with crude directions and a promise of reward in the black speech. He closed his hand over it until the paper tore. "There are more who will break," he said. Legolas looked towards the eastless sky. "The world itself is breaking." Aragorn rose. "Then we must arrive before the pieces fall apart." He sent riders ahead by another route, and the Rohirrim were saved from ambush by minutes. Had Targon lived longer, the host of Theoden would have been butchered in a narrow vale before song or horn was heard. Instead, they rode on, not knowing how narrowly dawnless death had passed beside them. In Minas Tirith, the hidden rot spread differently. Fear had a smell in the city now. Lamp smoke, unwashed wool, tallow, sweat dried beneath armor, and then damp again, stale rushes on the floors of the lower circles. Men laughed too loudly at small jests, then stopped at once, as if ashamed. Bread ran short, not because grain had vanished, but because bakers hoarded against a future no one could measure. Bells sounded at confused hours. Sleep lost its shape. Pippin, carrying messages through the stoneways, saw things the great did not. He saw a woman in the fourth circle trying to warm her baby's feet over a kitchen grate because the child would not stop crying. He saw 2 boys fighting over a crust near the gate, and when the loser ran, his breath flashed white. He saw a guardsman on the wall making the sign against evil every time he glanced upward. That night, Beregond took him aside beneath an arch where dripping water had frozen into clear daggers. "The men say the cocks do not know when to crow," Beregond murmured. "It unsettles them more than the drums from Mordor." Pippin tried a grin and nearly managed it. Then perhaps one should tell the cocks to show a little Gondorian discipline. Beregond smiled for the first time in days. It vanished quickly. "If this darkness is not the enemy's work," he said, "does that mean some greater power has deserted us?" Pippin thought of Gandalf's face when he stared east and found no comfort there. "I do not know," he said, and that was the truest answer in the city. At last, Gandalf understood enough to fear the whole of it. Alone in a high chamber, while the city below shuffled from watch to watch without daylight, he went inward along old memory, back beyond the grey havens, beyond the shaping of the sun and moon, to the gardens of the Valar and the names of fire. He was Olorin there, and wisdom moved more freely. In that remembering, he touched absence, not death, not captivity, withdrawal. He knew then. When he next met Denethor, the steward looked hollow-eyed, as though the dark itself had drunk from him. "They are gone," Gandalf said. Denethor frowned. "Who?" "The bearers. Tilion has left the moon. Arien has abandoned the sun." For once, Denethor's intelligence overcame his pride quickly enough to terrify him. He went still as stone under snow. "That cannot be. It has happened. Then we are cast off." "No," said Gandalf, though he could not wholly believe it. "But we are left to ourselves." Denethor laughed once, a dry and terrible sound, a distinction for the wise. Then came the assault. Without the sun, Mordor no longer needed to husband its strength through daylight. Great hosts moved constantly, a black river without banks. Grond rolled toward the great gate under crews that never flinched from exposure. Siege towers crept through the dark like moving cliffs. The Nazgul flew not at dawn or dusk, but at every hour, and their cries hung over the city until nerves frayed like old rope. The first breach on the Pelennor did not come by ram or catapult. It came by surrender. A lesser lord of Lebenin, Húrin's kinsman by distant marriage and keeper of a postern on the first circle, had spent 2 nights listening to the sky and deciding that history had ended. He opened the small gate before the enemy ever reached it, meaning to send out a runner with terms to the Southrons massed near the outer wall. Beregond found him in the act. Steel flashed in torchlight. The traitor died with his own keyring clenched in his hand, and the runner was thrown from the wall before he could cry out. When Pippin saw the body afterward, blood black in the lantern glow, he understood something new. Not all betrayals came from ambition. Some came from terror so complete that treason looked like shelter. Then Grond struck, and subtler sins were swallowed by thunder. What followed on the Pelennor was a battle remembered afterward as if fought at the bottom of the sea. Torches hissed in the wind. The mud was cold and clotted. Men could not judge distance well, and many died from blows they never saw. The orcs exulted, for darkness had become their natural country. The Mumakil loomed out of blackness like walking hills. Trumpets answered screams. The White City behind its walls seemed less a fortress than a ship besieged by storm. Theoden came at last out of the north with the Rohirrim in a surge of hoofbeats and horn calls that shook despair awake. Their charge under the stars was more terrible and beautiful than any daylight ride could have made it. Spears glittered. Horses plunged through the enemy ranks. Men of Gondor wept to hear that sound and struck harder for it. For a moment, it seemed enough. Then the Witch King descended. No morning weakened him. No sun climbed to challenge his terror. He fell upon the field like concentrated midnight, and where he rode, horses screamed and men forgot the names of their fathers. Theoden's mount buckled beneath dread and darting shadow. The king was thrown. Snow-white breath burst from horse and man alike. The beast of the Nazgul stooped, and its hooked beak tore through leather and flesh. Éowyn stood between the king and that horror, a small shape in a field of giants, and Merry crept behind with a sword ancient enough to wound what ordinary steel could not. Their courage did not lessen the darkness. It sharpened it. When Merry struck and Éowyn drove her blade home beneath the unseen crown, the Witch King died with a cry that emptied lungs all across the field. But victory claimed its price more cruelly here than in the tale that should have been. The black breath, unbroken by sunrise, clung longer and sank deeper. Éowyn did not fall merely unconscious. Her face went pale as hoarfrost, and, though she still drew breath when she was borne away, it came thin and ragged. Merry shook beside her, lips blue, hearing nothing but a dull ringing where the world had been. The field might still have been lost. At the height of slaughter, black ships appeared on the Anduin, and despair surged again along the walls of Minas Tirith. Men dropped their weapons. Women in the sixth circle began to pray aloud. Then the foremost ship ran up its standard, and out of that moving dark came Aragorn, son of Arathorn, with the Dunedain, the men of the southern fiefs, and behind them the memory of the dead, pale and wrathful. They struck the enemy flank like judgment. Haradrim broke. Orcs were driven into the river. The corsairs who had not already been mastered died against their own rails. Imrahil's knights rallied. Forlong fell with an axe in his neck. Duilin of Morthond took 3 arrows and kept fighting until the 4th pierced his eye. Men would later remember his banner still standing after he was dead, held up by the bodies piled around it. By the time the last organized companies of Mordor withdrew, the Pelennor was a plain of steaming ruin, and still no dawn came. That was the 4th turning, the victory that should have ended fear, and instead deepened it. In the Houses of Healing, Aragorn bent over Éowyn, Faramir, and Merry, while the city outside listened for a rooster that never crowed. Athalas steamed in bowls of hot water, filling the chambers with a scent like distant summers. His hands worked with a kingship older than crown or throne. He called them back from darkness one by one. Faramir returned. Merry returned, coughing as if he had swallowed snow. Éowyn lingered on the edge longer than either of them. Her spirit had gone where neither battle nor duty held meaning, and the world to which she might return seemed robbed of light worth living under. Aragorn spoke to her quietly, not as a commander, not as a healer, but as a man who knew weariness. "There is still shadow to resist," he said. "Do not yield the field to it." At length, she breathed more deeply. Her eyes opened, yet the bleakness in them was changed, not lifted. She had killed what no man could kill, and the world had not rewarded courage with mourning. Denethor was not saved. When the news of the field reached him, he believed first in defeat, then in hollow victory. Faramir's return he called a trick. The fallen darkness above seemed to confirm every private terror that Sauron had fed him. He set the pyre in the tomb-like chamber and would have burned both his son and his cities. Last reason if Pippin had not fled for Gandalf, and if Beregond had not once more stained his hands in loyalty. The struggle was uglier here, more desperate. Denethor fought like a man cornered by the collapse of the cosmos. When at last he broke from them and hurled himself into the fire, his scream rose up through the hidden shaft and seemed, for one instant, to join all the other cries in the lightless sky. Minas Tirith survived its steward. Outside the city, among the captains of the West, no one celebrated long. Sauron's power had been checked, but not broken. The heavens remained barren. Frost still silvered the trampled grass at hours when the sun should have warmed it. Corpses stiffened too quickly, and the wounded shivered under blankets beside fires that burned down with unnatural haste, as if a darkness fed on heat. Then Aragorn and Gandalf spoke long in a ruined pavilion while the banners snapped above them. "If we wait, we die slowly," Aragorn said. "Not by sword, by winter in spring, by failed seed, by men who despair before the next moon that does not rise." Gandalf sat with his staff across his knees. Weariness lined him more deeply than any there had ever seen. "Sauron did not make this wound," he said, "but he will use it. Every night that passes without order teaches fearful hearts to bow. Then we must draw him out." Gandalf looked up at the blank east. "There is another thing. If the ring is unmade and he falls, the strain upon the world may lessen. What fled in terror might yet return when his will is removed from the balance." "Might?" Aragorn said. "Yes. It was not enough for certainty. It was enough for war." So they marched on the Black Gate, not merely to distract the eye, but because there was suddenly no later worth preserving. In the fields behind them, widows were already breaking the crust of frozen gardens with iron rakes. In the Shire, barley shoots had gone grey. Along the coasts, tides bit at quays and retreated unpredictably. In Erebor, dwarves sealed lower gates against a cold draught rising from depths never before chilled. Every road of Middle-earth leaned toward one desperate wager. Frodo and Sam felt none of these counsels, only the diminishing of their own small strength. Time in Mordor had become a wound rubbed raw. Sleep came in fragments. Hunger was constant. Thirst scratched their throats like sand. The darkness above was no friend now. It swallowed landmarks and made ridges appear where none stood. More than once, Sam thought he saw a pale glow on a distant horizon and lifted his head in foolish hope, only to find some furnace in a slave camp or a trick of fire in volcanic smoke. Gollum grew bolder the longer the sky remained empty. He belonged to burrows and margins, and the loss of day seemed to him almost a restoration of old hidden rights. He watched them with wet, starry eyes and waited for the moment when pity, exhaustion, and doom would finally stop speaking to one another. When the captains of the West stood before the Morannon and challenged Sauron, the eye turned outward with wrath enough to shake the towers. At that same hour, Frodo and Sam reached the Samath Nar. Inside the mountain, there was light at last, but it was not merciful. Red fire pulsed through cracks in the stone. The air smelled of iron, sulfur, and the bitter end of all things. Frodo swayed as if drunk. Sam could hear his own heart over the distant battle outside. At the threshold, Gollum sprang. They went down together in ash. Teeth flashed. The ring hung on its chain like a drop of captive midnight. Sam dragged at Gollum, struck him, lost him again. Frodo rose and entered the chamber. At the lip of the fire, he put on the ring, and the doom long coiled through every age tightened all at once. In Barad-dûr, Sauron saw. The world held its breath. Then Gollum, shrieking with joy and greed too ancient for pity to cure, seized the ring and danced at the edge of the abyss. He bit, he capered, he slipped. Fire took him. The ring went with him into the heart of Orodruin, and the mountain answered like a god awakened in pain. The earth convulsed, towers split. The foundations of Barad-dûr came apart under their master's unraveling will. The Nazgûl wheeled overhead, suddenly mindless and doomed, and were swallowed in ruin. At the Morannon, ranks of orcs broke in animal panic, casting aside spears and standards alike. For one blazing span of moments, it seemed the world had chosen life. That was the fifth turning, and it would have been the ending sung forever if the sky had remembered its office. The eagles came. Gandalf found Frodo and Sam on the black slopes, half buried in ash, and bore them away from the collapsing land. The host of the West stood amid the wreck of the Black Gate and watched their enemies flee like vermin from a shattered nest. Men laughed, cried, dropped to their knees. Some embraced those they had hated. Some simply stared, unable to fit survival inside the shape of their fear. Relief moved through them almost like warmth. And then someone looked east. The horizon remained empty. No saffron line, no paling cloud, no wheel of day climbing from beyond Ifildueth. Above the ruin of Mordor there stretched only stars, pitiless and beautiful, burning over a world freed from one dark lord and still abandoned by its lights. The silence after that realization was heavier than battle. Gandalf knew before any word was spoken. He had hoped, as he had admitted only to Aragorn, that Sauron's fall might relieve the strain enough for Arien and Tilion to reclaim their paths. But fear once answered is not easily recalled, and whatever had driven them from their courses had not vanished with the ring. The wound in the world was deeper than one tyrant. When Frodo woke in Ithilien to birdsong that sounded thin and bewildered, he smiled at first, because birds meant morning in every memory he possessed. Then he saw the canvas above him, lit only by lantern flame and a wandering shaft of starlight. His smile faded, but not entirely. Sam was beside him, weeping for joy, and some mercies were still strong enough to stand without the sun. News travelled slowly through the recovering lands, and with each league it changed shape. In some places, people said Sauron had devoured the day and died choking on it. In others, they said the Valar had turned their faces away forever. In taverns, men invented skies that would return next week, next month, next harvest. Hope became rumour, because rumour was easier to carry. The months that followed were not the age of unbroken celebration that should have crowned the fall of Barad-dûr. They were an age of strange labour. Aragorn entered Minas Tirith in triumph, beneath stars instead of sunlight. His coronation was held with every lamp in the city lit, white and gold banners fluttering in a wind that smelled of wax and mountain snow. The people cried Elessar until their voices cracked. For one night, the darkness above seemed almost a roof of jewels laid lovingly over the city. The king wore the crown, and many thought that if any man could call the world back into order, it would be this one. Yet rule beneath a starved sky demanded different virtues than kings had once needed. Aragorn rationed seed. He reopened ancient granaries in the lower circles. He sent riders to Rohan not with congratulations, but with wagons of cured meat and stores of grain from southern fiefs that had not yet frozen. He dispatched shipwrights to Pelargir and Dol Amroth to strengthen quays against erratic tides. He kept the roads guarded because hunger, once it comes, teaches knives to men who once needed only ploughs. Arwen came to him in the City of Kings and wed him by starlight, silver on silver, beautiful enough to hurt the eye. But those who watched closely saw the change already working in her. She had chosen the fate of men in a world where men still expected seasons. In this altered age, the choice grew heavier. Without the sun, every year thinned her a little faster, as if some delicate nourishment had been withdrawn from her blood. In Rohan, the grass did not wholly fail, but it changed. The green sea turned first grey-green, then silver along many ridges. Horses cropped it warily and grew leaner. Foals born that year stood late and shivered in summer winds. Théoden was buried under a sky his fathers would not have known, and songs rose over him fierce and proud and pierced by bewilderment. Eoma took the crown and rode his borders relentlessly, not only against remaining enemies, but against wolves grown bold and bands of men who had lost allegiance with the weather. Éowyn healed in body, though the bruise left by the black breath seemed never quite to leave her face. She found in Faramir a gentleness not made weak by grief, and together they tended Ithilien, trying to coax gardens from a land that had become more twilight than spring. There were nights when they walked beneath the trees and said nothing, because silence felt more honest than comfort. Still they planted. In the Shire, the trouble came softer and therefore cut deeper. There were no great armies, no siege towers, no captains in black. There was only the slow realization that tomatoes would not redden, that apple blossom opened late and fell early, that mushrooms crowded in damp profusion where wheat should have thickened. Sam returned with Galadriel's gift of earth and spread it with loving hands across the party field and many gardens besides. Wherever he cast it, green things answered. But they answered strangely. White flowers came in abundance, luminous in the dark, and the malon he planted grew with astonishing grace, its leaves shining silver gold as though remembering both lost lights and belonging fully to neither. Children loved it at once. Older hobbits stood under it and fell silent. Milo Burrows' little daughter, who had once asked why the birds had forgotten to sing, asked a year later what sunrise had looked like. Her mother began to describe butter on bread, then marigolds, then embers stirred in a hearth, and none of it was enough. At the Grey Havens, ships departed more often. Elves had always been leaving, but now the departures took on a different sorrow. The world they had long preserved had not merely aged, it had dimmed. Théoden stood on the quays as vessel after vessel slipped westward over uncertain tides. Some among the Eldar said Varda had kindled Erendil's star more brightly in pity, and indeed, on certain clear nights, it burned with such piercing brilliance that men in Minas Tirith stopped in the streets to look. But one bright star could not be day, and one remembrance of the blessed realm could not feed an orchard. Gandalf remained long enough to help arrange what order he could. Yet even he seemed more distant, listening always for a music no one else could hear. When at last he departed with the ring-bearers, many watched the ship go and wondered if wisdom itself was withdrawing from the darkened shores. Frodo left not only because of wound and weariness, but because this altered Middle-earth had become doubly painful to him. He had carried a burden into shadow to save a world of fields, mornings, and ordinary warmth. He had succeeded, and the world was saved, but not restored. That paradox lodged in him like another shard. Sam wept at the havens and felt the salt wind rise and fall wrong against the stones. Years passed. Men adapted, because men always do. They measured time by stars, by work shifts, by bells, by colder and less cold seasons. New crafts appeared. In Gondor, great mirrored lanterns were raised on towers to cast steady light over fields near the city. In Rohan, herds were moved more often, chasing the best surviving grasses. In the Shire, root vegetables thrived and became beloved beyond reason. Along the Anduin, fishermen learned the wild tides as if learning the moods of an ill-tempered giant. Songs changed too. They grew less certain of endings. Victory was still sung, but now beside it stood endurance. Bards told of the ring's destruction with wonder, and then lowered their voices when they came to the part where the east remained dark. And always there lingered the question no king could answer. Had Tilion and Arien fled forever? Did they watch from some safe distance while Middle-earth endured the consequence of their fear? Or had they become trapped beyond return, unable to touch again the wounded vessels they had abandoned? Gandalf left no final certainty behind him. Perhaps there was none to give. In the first relief after Sauron's fall, many had called the New Age a triumph. In time, they named it something sadder and truer, the Twilight Reign. Yet it was not without beauty. There were evenings in Tilion when silver leaves moved under starfire, and every branch looked traced in memory. There were nights in Minas Tirith, when the white walls shone like pearl, and the king's banner floated under Arendil's star, as if hope had learned to live without assurance. In the Shire, the party tree's successor cast a glow over harvest suppers, and laughter still rose beneath it, though more softly than before. Love endured. Bread was baked. Children were born and told tales of a golden thing called day. That was the bittersweet mercy of Middle-earth. It did not cease simply because it had been forsaken by certain forms of light. It bent, it suffered, it continued. But continuation is not healing. In old age, Sam Gamgee would sit sometimes beneath the silver malin and tell the youngest hobbits of skies once blue enough to drown in, of shadows cast sharp on grass, of mornings that arrived not because bells rang for them, but because the world itself turned gladly toward warmth. The children listened as to a story of Beleriand or dragons, something immense and half-believed. When he finished, they would look up through the shining leaves into a darkness powdered with stars and try to imagine yellow. Far away, on the highest tower of Minas Tirith, the watch was never wholly abandoned. Generations of guards came and went. Some were devout, some dutiful, some merely cold and sleepy. Yet all of them, at the hour once called dawn, turned east by habit older than memory. Most saw only black mountains and the thin paling of starlight that was not morning. And so, the Fourth Age began in victory, endured in want, and ripened into a world that had survived evil only to inherit absence. Sauron was gone. The ring was ash. Kings returned. Gardens bloomed in silver. The seas still murmured against the havens. But above the White City, above the barrows of Rohan, above the chimneys of Hobbiton, and the long empty road to Mordor, the same unanswered horizon waited for a sunrise that had forgotten the world.